Welcome to Into the Truth, a new podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. I'm Pier Paolo Finaldi, the CEO and publisher of the CTS. Today I'm joined by Justin Brierley, a broadcaster, author and speaker, to talk about his recently published book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'll just give a little brief biographical sketch. Justin is a freelance writer, speaker and broadcaster who's become known for creating dialogues between Christians and non-Christians and is passionate about creating conversations around faith, science, theology and culture. Justin's also worked in radio, podcast and video for over 2 decades, so I'm feeling a little bit a bit wary of being with a real pro. Until April 2023, he was theology and apologetics editor for Premier Christian Radio and hosted the Unbelievable radio show, as well as the Ask NT Write Anything podcast. So tell me a bit about your own journey to faith, if you could.
Yeah, I was raised in a Christian family, and in many ways, that I grew up going to church, and knowing the Christian faith that way. It was in my mid to late teenage years that became real for me, and I suppose my journey towards exploring the more intellectual side of Christianity through apologetics and theology came partly through university, having my faith challenged there by skeptics and that sort of thing, discovering people like C.S. Lewis and others, pretty common way into Christian apologetics. But also having a bit of an interest in the creative expression of that and so on. And so that led me to express my faith and my interests through radio, eventually podcast, video.
Yeah, how did you get into radio then?
Radio, I sort of managed to get into by, the story is that I was looking for something in journalism after finishing university. My wife and I got married shortly after we finished university. We went on a gap year with a charity that took us to Namibia. And while I was there, the director of the charity came out to visit us as a sort of missionary couple staying there. And he had just been on this Christian radio station called Premier Christian Radio to talk about the work of the charity. And he said, "I know you're looking for something, Justin. Would you be interested in this?" And so I, from Namibia, a little internet cafe in the near local town, sent a sort of email, and that turned into some work experience when I returned, which turned into 20 years of working at the radio station and being able to present shows like Unbelievable and other shows over those years.
And I think in terms of radio, I think many people have been kind of predicting its death for probably decades, and yet in a sense
it's holding on.
It's holding on and moving seamlessly into this world of podcast. I mean,
communication constantly changes, as I'm sure you know, as a publisher of books and so on. But I think what continues to be attractive about radio is its immediacy and the sense of intimacy you can have, I think, and the way you get to know people. I think that also is happening now in the podcast world. So there's lots of new tools for doing that. But I think we're now seeing a real kind of mixture of radio and podcast coming together in many ways. Every radio station has all its shows really on podcast as well now. So it's just a question of how people listen.
Yeah, and it almost makes kind of no difference to people whether they're listening to sort of extracts through social media or actually kind of tuning in with a radio. That seems to happen kind of less, but it doesn't mean that the content isn't being listened to. So let's kind of turn to this book. I mean, to give a bit of context, I suppose the census results that came out recently in the UK showed that Christianity, I think, has become a minority religion in the UK for the first time probably since, I don't know, the sort of 5th century or something.
Yes, certainly less than half of people for the first time ticked the Christian box, which was quite a watershed in some ways. It's still obviously the major religion, but it does just show the way things have changed in terms of just the way in which people used to, just culturally at least, think of themselves as Christian. And I just think that doesn't really exist in the UK, and is heading in the same direction, to be honest, especially among younger generations in the USA, in places where there is still at least a fairly strong Christian, sort of majority of some sort. So that's but that I don't think that the census results really came as a surprise to that many people. I think that had been the trajectory for quite a while.
I mean, you start your book with this this poem "Dover Beach" by Matthew Arnold, in which has been kind of often used as a way of describing the situation that's kind of come about in the UK with this slow withdrawal. Well, I suppose at times slow and at times kind of a bit quick withdrawal of faith. I mean, tell us a bit about that and why you thought it was important to kind of use that.
Poem, Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, has often been used, especially the stanza about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, has often been used as an image for the continued secularization of the West and Europe. And even 150 years ago, Matthew Arnold, recognized that in his day. And that's only really accelerated, obviously, up to the present day. And I used that particular analogy at the beginning of the book and really throughout the book as well, because I had an interesting conversation a couple of years ago with Douglas Murray, who's, quite an interesting thinker, conservative sort of political pundit, but who, in this conversation, I had him on with N.T. Wright, quite a well-known New Testament scholar, and we were talking about how to kind of make sense of life in a post-Christian culture. And Douglas Murray himself has sometimes described himself as a Christian atheist, interestingly. Yeah. And he referenced this well-worn line from Matthew Arnold and said, but the thing is, Justin, the point about the sea of faith going out is that it could come back in again. Yeah. That's the point of tides. And I thought it was interesting. That was a catalyst, really, for me starting to think about writing this book, because Douglas Murray's own story is an interesting one. He had some kind of a faith, I think, through childhood to his early 20s, but sort of lost it essentially because of New Atheism, arguably. He was great friends with Christopher Hitchens and that clique. But I think he also fairly quickly came to realize that actually atheism isn't a philosophy that you can essentially draw meaning or purpose from. And he realized that actually, to the degree that he does believe in human rights, dignity, value, all of those moral instincts, he saw that they came from the Christianity that had informed the West. So that's why he calls himself a Christian atheist. And I think he, among others, are part of a new set of thinkers who have recognized that actually we still sort of at a subliminal level almost are feeding off the embers of the Christian story.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things I think that we can come back to with because Douglas Murray he does show he does sort of fit a kind of template of some of these thinkers who see the kind of the goodness of Christianity and what it brings, but kind of can't quite kind of bring themselves to go all the way. But we'll come back to that. You begin the book talking about this period, which I think we all lived through in the early 2000s, which was this sudden kind of rise of what has come to be known as the New Atheism, with the four horsemen of the New Atheism, which maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you think about those four and what they brought to the atheist party. And in a sense, it was. I mean, have you got a feeling about kind of where that came from? Why did it suddenly happen, and why did it kind of have such a kind of worldwide and big effect?
I think it started primarily. There were a few different factors I think that came together. 9/11 was an important part of that, and this sense that religion could do terrible things, or terrible things could be done in the name of religion, at least. And there was a real, I think, pushback against sort of having to give religion some sort of respect when obviously a lot of people felt that actually it was a cause of great evil in the world. You had that, plus you had certain sort of culture war issues of its time going on in the US sort of an evangelical president in George W. Bush, which some people on the left and the secular left were concerned about. You had issues around science and faith. There was, a trial going on about whether intelligent design could be taught in the classroom. And all these sorts of things, I think, came together at the same time to form a kind of sense that something had to be done among certain types of secularists and atheists. And then you add that to the blossoming of the internet, essentially, in the mid-2000s. And suddenly lots of different people found common cause and were able to join together. And I think new atheism was all fueled by those sorts of factors. But as you say, led by the so-called Four Horsemen, who I don't think were ever voted into office, but they sort of, for some reason, became the standard bearers of this movement. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett. And each of them in their own way had a best-selling anti-God book. Richard Dawkins, obviously well known for The God Delusion. And this movement, just seemed to proliferate. They had a lot of airtime, a lot of opinion pieces, TV appearances. There was even the atheist bus campaign here in the UK. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So lots of momentum behind that movement for a good time.
I mean, it's interesting that, you had 2 Americans and 2 Brits. And it was a very, I think it was a sort of Anglo-Saxon kind of led, or Anglosphere-led kind of campaign in a sense. Why do you think that do you think that it kind of grew particularly in our milieu?
I think because, in a funny way, Western culture has bred atheism in the sense it's Western culture that has undergone this secular sort of transformation in many ways. It's interesting because, ironically, while a lot of people assume, secularism, atheism, non-religion is kind of growing fast, and it is across the West. And in fact, as a proportion of the global population, atheism is actually decreasing because, in fact, religious cultures tend to have more children than atheistic Western cultures. And so that's the irony of the thing, is that if you just were looking at our situation in the West, you might get an outsized picture of this atheist movement. But I think effectively atheism is a sort of a Western phenomenon, and it's interesting to see some of the roots of that. And so it was, I suppose, almost inevitable that it would be led by Westerners on both sides of the Atlantic. I
mean, I always also got the feeling that it was a kind of intellectually kind of elitist project.
Yes.
And I remember, even sort of some members of my family, extended family, that kind of got interested in that and watched that program. What was it called? Basically went around and spoke to kind of Christians in Christian kind of hicks in America. And
was that the one by Richard Dawkins?
Yes,
The Root of Evil.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right.
It was published around the same time as the book was.
You get the feeling often that they were kind of really targeting kind of easy targets in one sense.
Low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right, and I think that was one of the criticisms really that came out about the movement, was that they did take aim at easy targets, straw men. They didn't really rigorously engage the best Christian arguments for God and that sort of thing. In fact, I was involved in quite a funny campaign in 2011 to try to get Richard Dawkins to actually debate, a real kind of serious opponent. So William Lane Craig is quite a well-known Christian philosopher who had, on behalf of him, various bodies had invited Richard Dawkins to actually have a proper debate and, defend the thesis of his book, The God Delusion. But he kept running away from actually engaging him, gave all kinds of different excuses, to the point where when Craig was due to come over for a tour and some debates that I was helping to host, in lieu of the atheist bus campaign, we actually put our own bus campaign around Oxford, which said there's probably no Dawkins, because he'd been issued this invitation to come and debate but had refused. But we said, but come along to the Sheldonian Theatre and find out on such and such a date.
I mean, do you think? I mean, in your subtitle you talk about like atheism kind of grew old, and it's true. It did kind of run out of steam a little bit, and started also in its kind of rhetoric became kind of passé quite quickly. I mean, do you think that's because in the end it had because, for example, they didn't really engage with the best arguments? That it had a certain amount of in the end, it was at the surface,
Yeah.
and didn't really go as deep as it probably ought to have.
I think it essentially, and it still exists in various corners of the internet. You will run into plenty of new atheism in the comments on Facebook and YouTube and that sort of thing. But it is at that quite surface level, I think, and it's good for memes, But actually, when confronted with some of the deeper questions of life and some of the reality of the nature of our universe and so on, I don't think it actually holds up very well. And so it was kind of interesting because there was a lot of popular appeal, and a lot of it was sort of essentially based more on derision and mockery and sort of making fun of things. So if there was
Christopher Hitchens, that was his kind of
it was very rhetorical in that sense. But then when he actually faced an opponent, he did at least debate Craig. He actually didn't have much to say, in all honesty. Likewise, there was this Reason rally in 2012, which was sort of an atheist rally in Washington, D.C. And, the main message that came through from Richard Dawkins there was, mock them, ridicule them. This was the kind of way of doing things at that time. But I think in the end, that was a bad strategy because in the end, you can only go so far on that kind of ethos. And the problem, I think, ultimately with New Atheism was once they'd sort of torn down belief in God or attempted to tear down belief in God, they didn't really have anything to replace God with because science and reason doesn't buy you meaning and purpose and identity. It's not the right tool for that. And what I found was that as the New Atheism ran out of steam, it ran out of steam partly because having denied God, it couldn't put anything positive in God's place to replace that. And people are looking for something to live for, not just to speak against.
I mean, also in terms of taking mocking and ridicule, I mean, we've been doing that since Christ himself. That it didn't work on Christ, and it kind of it's not really been the best strategy through history.
And most people who actually know people of faith will know that. Will very soon learn that the caricatures that you see online and elsewhere are not representative of people's actual life and their faith. So I think it was always going to run its course. I mean, the other interesting thing about the New Atheism is I think there were these external factors that it wasn't ultimately answering people's deepest questions. But I think internally as a movement, it sort of started to fracture and unravel for all kinds of interesting cultural
reasons. I mean,
too.
I suppose partly the death of Christopher Hitchens, I think, took a lot of the fun out of the movement. I think, I hardly ever agreed with him on anything, but I loved reading his stuff. The rhetorical fireworks.
And of all four of them, he was the one who actually was genuinely friends with a lot of his Christian opponents. And I found that very refreshing because even though, he would put on a great show, in debate, you got the sense that he was actually a pretty nice, like a fun person to be around. Whereas some of the others, you just got the sense that they were just a little bit more sour. About the whole thing. Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting that you talk about the kind of the fracturing of the movement, and also its the fact that it wasn't able to kind of propose a positive kind of alternative being a big problem. I remember at one point. I think it became clear to them, especially Dawkins at one point, that whatever would come in and kind of replace the Christian culture wasn't necessarily going to be any better. In fact, it was probably going to be a hell of a lot worse.
Yeah, I think I make this case in the book, but I've seen it being repeated in lots of places since the book's been published. But that effectively, by sort of sweeping the floor clear of the God story, the New Atheism actually simply created a void for lots of other potential stories to come in. It wasn't replaced by this scientific rationalist utopia that I think a lot of New Atheists naively assumed would be where people would go in the absence of a religious story. What it's been replaced with is all kinds of other sort of quasi-religious stories. And this was really partly what started to fracture the movement itself. There were some who wanted to say, well, we're not just atheists, we're also atheists who have a positive commitment to feminism and LGBT rights and lots of progressive issues, and others who said, no, that's all political stuff. We're just here for the science and the reason and the free thinking. And so the so-called atheism plus movement started to go in what we would now might call a woke direction, if you like. And there were others more in the Richard Dawkins mold who sort of stood against that and felt it was all political correctness. So the movement itself started to the culture wars essentially divided the atheist movement itself early on. And sort of 15 or 20 years down the line, you can easily see now the way in which actually, rather than science and reason replacing the God question, it's all kinds of other quasi-religious ideologies that now people regard as sacred and sacrosanct. So on the progressive left, sexuality and gender, the obvious examples. But, you've got those on the right as well, the cult of Donald Trump or whatever it might be. There's something that people replace the God story with another sort of sacred story.
Well, which is what kind of Chesterton said maybe kind of 100 years ago, which was when people stop believing something, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything.
Yes.
And I mean, we've come to see that. And in a sense, this movement, which was always kind of arguing for kind of rigorous, logical, scientific thought, has kind of almost brought us to some of, as you said, like the gender movement, which has so many kind of internal kind of contradictions and a lack of logic. I don't know whether they didn't kind of foresee that.
I think it came as a surprise to a lot of them. So I think Dawkins is a great example of this, where I think he's now realizing, well, it was better the devil you knew with your religious counterparts. At least there was a sort of a question of truth on the table and a sort of a clear kind of. Whereas I think he's now feeling the effects of essentially a lot of his own peers turning on him because he has taken this quite gender critical perspective, critiquing the transgender movement and so on. And suddenly a lot of the people he used to be on platforms with, sharing stages with, secular folk, he suddenly found critiquing him. He, in 2021, he was stripped of his Humanist of the Year award by the Humanist Association of America because of his perspective on transgender, which just goes to show how much that movement has sort of, dissipated and split up. So it's really interesting because the changing sort of cultural forces mean that you then find, not only do you find former secular and atheists who were once friends now pitted against each other, you also find certain ex-new atheist types who are now far more friendly towards Christians who perhaps share common concern with some of the ways in which culture is going.
Something that you mentioned, which was that 9/11 was a big kind of catalyst for this, and I think that the idea of kind of lumping all religions together and seeing them all as kind of equally awful or leading to the same thing, I think that narrative. I mean, I don't know if that kind of broke down or if, in a sense, there were only a couple of them that were really willing to kind of see it through in terms of, and would you say that it ended up being something kind of mainly directed against Christianity, or because it was too kind of risky to really criticize Islam, or was it really just that in the end, as you say in the book, that some of the big kind of all the big humanist conferences always take place in basically Christian countries. So what would you say about the relationship of new atheism with Christianity versus Islam?
I think it was a very blunt and unnuanced way of kind of critiquing religion, and it did tend to just throw them all in the same pot, when in fact, obviously 9/11 was a very specific outcome of a very specific religious worldview. And I think latterly a number of the new atheists have come to realise that they've made a mistake by trying to make out that it was all the same or all coming from the same motivations. And it is interesting, to see the way that even, the way that the sarcasm and humour was dispensed tended to be mainly at the expense of Christians. I remember the P.Z. Myers has been a well-known sort of atheist blogger, very willing to cause offence. And one of the most sort of high-profile things he did was to sort of steal a communion wafer from a Catholic church in mass and sort of desecrate it, live on his blog and this sort of thing. And I thought, but I haven't seen you do anything similar with the Quran recently. And this double standard, I think, is because people know that in a Christian culture, ironically, they're not going to get themselves beheaded for doing that, whereas they could easily, in an Islamic situation. And so there has been this double standard about, the nature of different religious expressions. at the same time, I just think that a lot of the atheists today are realizing that there's a reason why the Judeo-Christian heritage has provided them the ability to critique and make fun of religion. It's because of the Christian principles that undergird the West that you can be an atheist, if you like. And that's, perhaps we'll move on to talk about it, but this was very specifically Ayaan Hirsi Ali's perspective. And I think what separates her is that she came out of a very fundamentalist Islamic background, and her rejection of God came from that. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Chris Fitchens, they come from an essentially Christian background, and they're rejecting the Christian God. So there's a very different reason why now we find Ayaan Hirsi Ali suddenly being drawn back towards faith in that sense.
Yeah. No, and I mean, with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, it was very interesting to listen to. This is stuff that I think she's sort of declared herself a Christian, I think, since the book came out. And she was very connected to the new atheists right from the beginning. But you say, in a sense, she had a kind of an Islamic atheism, whereas I think the rest of them were basically kind of Christian atheists, should we say. But it's interesting that she has taken quite an... I mean, I've heard her speak on a couple of podcasts and things, in which I'm not sure if she's had like a real kind of personal encounter with Christ, but she's sort of recognized the value of what Christianity has managed to produce in a society which she is very appreciative of. And in one sense, I think even Dawkins at a certain point has kind of admitted. I mean, I always found it funny. I think when he was asked, what his favourite music was, and I think his favourite piece of music and it was the same piece of music that Pope Benedict said was his favourite one, Bach's Matthew's Passion. And I think to appreciate the kind of product or the consequences of Christian culture, but be so kind of adamantly against Christianity itself, I think at a certain point it stops having a real kind of heft.
I do think though that even Dawkins has mellowed, and I think it's because he's starting to stare into the abyss of what a truly post-Christian culture looks like, and he's realised it's not this scientific utopia he'd hoped it would be. And I think he's somewhat sympathetic, actually, to why Ayaan has gone the route she's gone, even though he doesn't appear to be going down it himself. But I think he's a little bit more cognizant of the fact that there are better and worse forms of religion, and if people are inherently religious in some way, then they might just be better off with Christianity than the quasi-religion of woke ideology or Islamism or whatever. And to that extent, I think he's kind of softened a bit, actually, his critique of religion. I don't think he'd write a book like The God Delusion today, because the situation has changed quite a lot.
And it's interesting to see those that maybe have taken up the baton. I would say, maybe the cosmic skeptic. His style is completely different, and in fact, often if you listen to some of his interviews, they're extremely polite, extremely engaging with the questions. He's talking to quite impressive philosophers like, I don't know, Ed Feser or even with Bishop Barron, and it's more of a kind of dialogue to see whether we can reach some.
I know Alex quite well, who has gone online for a long time as Cosmic Skeptic, but in fact, funnily enough, our paths first crossed when I sort of put out an apologetics video of my own, sort of defending the fine-tuning argument, and he used it in his early years as a sort of teenage YouTuber. He did a kind of takedown critique type thing of it, and he now looks back on some of those early videos, which were very much inspired by that new atheist Hitchensian kind of make fun of religion type of thing. He sort of cringes a bit at some of the vibe, really, and the arguments he used. I think he's gone on a real journey, interestingly, of kind of coming to see that actually there are good reasons why people hold to Christian faith, that it's not a complete delusion. And I think he's a lot more respectful of the different sides that engage. I mean, he's still an atheist, but he kind of acknowledges that actually his dismissal of some of the key Christian arguments was frankly naive and not well done. And yeah, he's just at the time of recording, he's just recently released an interesting interview with Richard Dawkins where I think he does a great job actually of asking the kind of questions I would want to ask Richard Dawkins. So even though he is an atheist like Dawkins, he's still sort of asking sort of, incisive, penetrating questions, not simply fawning over, the grandfather of new atheism or whatever.
Yeah, and it seems like he's not kind of afraid of following the questions to whatever conclusion they might have, rather than having a kind of. I think you got the feeling with the Four Horsemen that it was that was the conclusion,
and that can happen on both sides. There's plenty of Christian apologetics that sort of is a foregone conclusion, and so I think we all like to kind of have our assumptions confirmed. That's why we live in a world of echo chambers on social media and everything else. But I think Alex is a fine example, as you say, of someone genuinely trying to hear both sides and give it a fair assessment.
I mean, moving on to, I think, the other kind of subtitle of your book about the secular thinkers who are now considering Christianity. And I think they have often become, I don't know, I could say like the kind of gateway drug in a sense to people really exploring Christianity again. And I mean, before going into that, the big numbers, the census numbers, say that Christianity is withdrawing. That long kind of roar of withdrawal is continuing. I mean, I do wonder whether Matthew Arnold would be surprised at quite how long it's taken for the withdrawal to kind of take place, and the feeling that maybe we're starting to kind of go in the other direction. I mean, the big numbers would say not yet, but certainly at the level of often kind of quite influential cultural commentators, etc. I would say that there's been a turning of the tide. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, one of the criticisms I got when I launched the book, especially from atheists on Twitter and so on, was, what do you mean a surprising rebirth of belief in God? Haven't you seen the statistics? And of course, I quote the statistics from the start of the book. But what I'm describing, I think, if it's anything, it is just that turning of the tide. It's not that we've got some tidal wave rushing back towards us at this point. But I just see the signs of this potential turning. And obviously, a lot of those signs take a long time to filter down into culture. We may see yet, though, that we're standing downstream of that more and more people. And I do see some of these secular thinkers as the first fruits of this sort of renewed interest in God and the story of Christianity, and the way that they have been a gateway drug, as you say, to a lot of people actually embracing Orthodox Christianity. Now, again, this is more anecdotal at this point. It's the sense that, I keep hearing about people who are reconsidering Christianity, but I don't have any statistics that will bear that out. So what I'm kind of, it's a kind of an optimistic thesis that actually something is happening further upstream that we may yet see the results of. And one of the obvious examples of that is, a person like Jordan Peterson, who draws a huge audience and, burst onto the scene in sort of 2017, 2018, because he was, drawing massive numbers to 3-hour lectures on the Book of Genesis. Now, that would have seemed bizarre, 15 years earlier at the height of New Atheism. But I see a lot of the audience that were turning out for the New Atheists having kind of been somewhat disappointed, I think, in the existential answers ultimately they offered. They're turning to these sort of other sages like Peterson, who seem a lot more ready to point people back to the Christian story, even if they have a sort of interesting...
So let's talk about the Peterson phenomenon. I mean, so he basically first came to prominence in an argument about what is it? It was kind of forced speech, basically.
Yeah, sort of. Canada was thinking about enshrining sort of speech around transgender and so on into law at the time.
Yeah, and he refused to take part in that, and that made there was a kind of viral video of him speaking to some of the students, and it kind of pivoted away from. I mean, although he's continued to speak about, the kind of, I suppose the woke culture wars. But in the end, I think it's been some of his more kind of considered, some of his longer essentially explorations of meaning, of what makes the human person kind of tick, that has really, I think, touched people. You know, he's been able to reach out also to a group of people who really were a bit at sea and wondering what their life was all about, which is young men in particular. And it's interesting that I think, apart from Ian Hersey Ali, this has been a discussion mainly about men who have ended up, you know, in this, and this is something that Jordan Peterson has used, this kind of meaning crisis. Do you want to say something about that, and where you think that's why did that kind of come to a head?
I think that's exactly what Peterson has been tapping into, and you do kind of get two Jordan Petersons. You get the one on Twitter where it's all kind of woke rage or whatever. But you do get this much more considered, nuanced version of Peterson in his long lectures and on his podcast and other places where he really does seem to be tapping into a real meaning crisis in our culture, especially among young men, which I think is ultimately an identity crisis. Because I think what he recognizes is that in that Chestertonian way, when you take away God, something will come in to fill the void. And often these are very insubstantial, you know, stories that don't ultimately make sense of us. And so I think he's been recognizing that the Christian story has been the center point of meaning, culture, purpose, and identity in people's lives, whether they realized it or not, for millennia. And so he's sort of just at a psychological level is saying, here's a story that's worth thinking about again, because it's probably the thing that you're missing in your life. And I've, as I say, seen a lot of young men who have just been able to take Christianity and the Bible seriously again, because he kind of gave them permission to do so through his lectures, through his books, and so on. And so I think that's a really fascinating change. As I say, he's kind of had various interesting interactions with the new atheist folk. You know, Sam Harris, he's done several.
Oh, he had that excruciating series of discussions about where to get your morality from, which just I think they went on for sort of 3 or 4 hours, and they were a real difficult listen. I don't know if you listened to those.
I probably have. You know, there's lots of things. I mean, he did this series of stadium debates basically with Harris along these lines, which again is just an interesting phenomena. You know, 20,000 people turning out in the O2 arena to hear two people talk for 2 or 3 hours on stage.
Who saw that coming?
Exactly, yeah. So there's all of that going on, and he's, I think, just scratching at this itch among millennials and Gen Z who are asking, what is life actually about? Why am I so depressed, basically? Why can't I seem to get out of bed in the morning? And I think it's those very existential questions that Jordan Peterson then gives us sort of a spiritual potential solution to. And I find that really interesting. Now, so I find myself very encouraged at one level that he's sort of sending people back to the Bible. But I also want to push him to go a bit further, because I think ultimately, I think he does stop at a kind of psychological take on the Bible, that this is a sort of Jesus is the archetype exactly of, you know, heroism and bravery and love and all of that. But I want to kind of, I feel like he's on a C.S. Lewis kind of journey where he's recognized that kind of mythic, imaginative realm is so important. But I want to say, but it actually maps onto a historical, objective realm of a person who came and
and he often sidesteps that question as to whether he thinks it's true or not. You know, he says, exactly. What do you mean by is? What do you mean by true? And you know, in a sense, you think, okay, he's obviously not ready to sort of come down one side.
I don't know.
Well, his wife apparently is becoming Catholic.
Yes, she has become Catholic. She's embraced her. I think there was some Catholicism possibly in the past, but interestingly, her journey, as far as I'm aware, is partly because of the witness of a Catholic friend who, while she was very ill, came and played with her and so on. And that's become very important to her. Interestingly, his daughter, Michaela, has also become a Christian. So it feels like the net's closing in a bit on Peterson. And he has constantly surrounded himself with interesting Christian thinkers, you know, people from the Catholic world, Bishop Barron, but also the Eastern Orthodox world, Jonathan Pageau.
Well, Jonathan Pageau
is a great sort of, you know, collaborator of his. And so you do get this sense that Peterson is very sold on this idea that the Christian story is absolutely central. But I think, he keeps people guessing as to where exactly it
It
lands.
reminds me a bit of Chesterton when he wrote, I think when he wrote Orthodoxy, and a lot of people read it and converted to Catholicism, and he didn't do so for like another 10 or 15 years.
Interesting, yeah.
And I think later he said he'd kind of held the door open for other people without going through himself.
I think that's a brilliant way of expressing perhaps what Peterson has been doing, because I've met people who have essentially are Christians now because of Peterson, but it's almost like he hasn't quite walked through the door he's opened himself. And I don't know, I mean, at one level, part of me sees that there's actually a value in people from outside of the church pointing people back towards the Christian faith, because sometimes those are the only people that they will listen to. If it's you or I, sometimes it feels like, you've already got a pre-commitment to this. You're selling me something.
You're not neutral on this.
Exactly. Whereas when a Douglas Murray or a Tom Holland or an Ian Hesiali or a Peterson sort of starts to make these kinds of noises, suddenly people wake up and go, "Oh, I hadn't expected them to say that." And it just, I think it gives people fresh ears to potentially hear.
No, I mean, I keep mentioning Chesterton because I do think that there's a kind of similarity between sort of Peterson and Chesterton as these sort of great kind of communicators. And one of the big kind of questions, I mean, that we've had internally in the Catholic Church about whether to put Chesterton forward for canonization is like, well, if we do that, maybe people won't just read him as an author, but will dismiss him as like, he's one of them, so I won't actually give him a kind of a fair listen. So I mean, we'll see what happens with Peterson. The other person that you mentioned quite a lot is the historian Tom Holland, a podcaster who we all want to emulate in his great success in his wonderful historical podcast, in which he's basically taken the role of kind of defensor fidei, essentially. And his book Dominion, which I think was it did something very interesting, which is it basically said, listen, you like it or not, every assumption that you probably have about what is good, about what is moral, about what are the positive things in our society, in our life, comes from Christianity. And, I think I also studied classics at university, and it's true that when you read that stuff, when you read the Iliad or when you read the Greek tragedies, there are things there which are just like really odd, cruelty that and acts of heroism which are killing loads of people, and why, and you read it and you think this is strange, this doesn't kind of match up with the what I think is heroic. And Holland basically goes through an incredibly kind of tightly argued, very long and very well backed up series of arguments to say, look, this is what everything that we are has come from Christianity. And again, I mean, he's now making this argument, wherever, to anyone who'll listen.
Yeah, and he's become a real, I think, thorn in the side of some of his secular peers who wanted to believe that our belief in human value, dignity, rights, freedom, compassion, progress, even science, all basically stemmed from some sort of rational, enlightenment.
It was natural we were going to get there.
Exactly. And I think Holland has just done an amazing job at showing that's naive at best and misleading at worst, because it's clear that all of those things we value come from the Christian Revolution 2,000 years ago. The idea of human rights is not natural and universal. There's plenty of places in the world today where it's simply people don't hold to that. It's bred from a very particular Christian tradition that has come down through the centuries. And exactly as you say, it was his own living in the sandals, if you like, of the Greeks and the Romans, and this sense of how alien so much of their culture was and the way they treated women and children, just the fact slavery was a de facto part of the system. All of that led him to realize that his own beliefs in human dignity, freedom, equality, and so on were very alien to this world. Where had they come from? Well, not from science, not from the Enlightenment. He realized it was Jesus, it was the early Christian movement that kind of radically reshaped the way the West ultimately thought about that. And quite rightly, as you point out, he's trying to just remind people that this is the water they swim in, because like goldfish, people just assume that this is just the way it's always been. Surely this is what any common sense person would believe. And he wants to just shake people out of that and say, no, and actually it might go away. This might not stick around forever. There are people with different ways of thinking about life in the world today. China is a growing superpower. What about their vision of reality? So I think he's a really important voice for helping people kind of just remember where their actual moral instincts came from.
Which has been one of the major kind of arguments against atheism, which is to say, well, where are we going to get our who's ultimately going to decide what's right and what's wrong, and also in the way that we treat each other, in the way that in who gets to live and who gets to die. Essentially, I mean that's how it was under the Romans, how it was under the Greeks. The pater familias had right of life and death over the members of his household. Why did that stop?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that argument, which was the one that kind of Peterson was also pursuing, I think is one of the most important ones. Although, the kind of moral relativism that we've been kind of living in, I think is much less relative than we tend to think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's two ways to approach this. For a long time in my kind of apologetics career, I've been a big fan of the argument from morality for God, essentially, that if you do believe that there is an objective realm of moral duties and values, then it's very hard to ground that in a godless universe, and this was arguably the argument that brought Lewis to theism, that he said, how could I critique, Christianity or God for being unjust, because I had to have a standard of justice for that concept to even make sense. And he came to realize he could only believe in justice, right and wrong, if there was some sort of transcendent moral law and a moral lawgiver. So there's a kind of philosophical way into this thing. What I think interestingly Holland's done is he, while that stands, he says whether or not you take, you believe that there's a philosophical argument for God from the fact we tend to believe that in a moral law, where did we in fact get the moral law that tends to inform our Western conscience? And he's shown so clearly that it is also tied to Christianity. So I think the two of these things coming together makes for quite an interesting argument that atheism cannot either philosophically sustain our belief in morality, but that it's never contributed to our actual beliefs in morality either, because it's Christianity that has done that. And as we said earlier, the atheists that exist in the West tend to be largely Christian atheists. They sort of think in very Christian terms, even to the point where, if Dawkins critiques the Bible, he has this famous phrase about this terrible God of the Old Testament and, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniac bully. And but the point is, he's actually judging the God of the Old Testament on Christian principles. He could only make that argument against what he sees as this terrible God in the Old Testament because of the Bible that gave him the morality.
Who says filicide is wrong?
Yeah, exactly. And this came home, actually. I interviewed a really interesting convert, very recent convert to Christianity, who came from China. And she went on this interesting journey, having come to the UK, where she started to realise in a sort of Tom Holland-esque way that the reason the culture was so different to her native home was because of this Christian heritage. And she said she started watching some of the debates that Dawkins was having, and she sort of wanted to scream at him, you couldn't be that kind of atheist where I come from, because no one would bat an eyelid at a God who, presses people into the ground. That's just life in China. There is authoritarianism, and people accept it. So she herself recognised that you can only be the kind of Christian you are because of the kind of atheist you are because of the Christian, environment that produced you, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought was I mean, I was present at a debate that you chaired. Well, it wasn't a debate; it was more a discussion between Tom Holland and Bishop Barron, and it was very interesting because Tom Holland, he was kind of cheerleading like a kind of revival of Christianity, especially in England, and was kind of giving some, I thought, some quite interesting and quite useful tips on what he thought the churches could do in order to, in order to really turn the tide. And one thing that he spoke about, and that he often talks about, is kind of make Christianity weird again. Do you want to say something about that?
And he's not the only one. I've heard similar sentiments from others, including Douglas Murray and others, which is that the thing that really turns him off, if you like, church, is when it just looks like the rest of the culture. When it's so watered down that it's just sort of humanist principles with a smattering of God on top. As he said, he's looking for mystery. He's looking for awe, wonder. He wants to be re-enchanted with a different world. And that's why I think when he does find himself in church, Tom Holland tends to go to a very ancient Anglo-Catholic form of, worship, because it transports him. And that's sort of what he's looking for. And likewise, when I had that conversation I mentioned with Douglas Murray, where he talked about the potential of the tide coming back in, he referenced the fact that a number of his secular peers he'd been surprised to find converting to Christianity, but frequently going to the oldest forms. So, the sort of embracing the Tridentine form of, Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever. And I think the way he put it is they want to return to the deepest wells, he said. And I get the feeling that for him as well, he doesn't want just a sort of warmed over, good advice type of version of Christianity.
Sort of NHS with a stole on.
Yeah, that again was a criticism of Tom Holland's, especially during the pandemic. He felt the church missed its true vocation there, which was to be a spiritual solace to the nation, not just another wing of the, civil service telling people to wash their hands. And I get that, and I think there's a sense in which I agree. I think that is an important principle. Keep Christianity weird. It's, the reason Christianity became so successful in its early centuries was because it was weird. It was so different to the Roman and Greco-Roman culture, and sometimes we want to make Christianity completely unobjectionable and sort of so like the culture. But it becomes invisible when you do that, and I think that's the problem with.
And it was willing to take stands that were really very different from those around. Especially with regard to things like suffering and death, and say something completely different. And that's why I think we missed such an opportunity as Christians during the pandemic. We've been talking about suffering and death for over 2,000 years and have an answer to it. And instead we spoke about kind of washing our hands, and that was a real missed opportunity to talk about something which, I think we've got something to say about.
Absolutely. And that, I think Tom Holland feels the same way. That he said that, one of the most moving things he saw in the early months of the pandemic was seeing some, Pope Francis presiding over a mass where, the whole of the Vatican, there were no crowds there and so on. But there was something very...
bringing out a cross that had been processed through the streets of Rome during the
previous plagues. So I think there's something about that, isn't there? And I also get that sense that people are looking for something to re-enchant their lives. They don't want just a sort of watered down version of Christianity.
Yeah, and also, I think if you're going to make that kind of countercultural choice of going to church, you might as well go the whole hog and have bells and smells and beautiful music and all the rest, rather than a kind of warmed over, secular game show, basically.
Yes, yeah, I think that's the great danger, isn't it? It's sometimes the church has tried to attract people in through either kind of watering down its theology or its commitments, or, as you say, turning itself into a sort of an entertainment thing. But the reality is, you can get better music down the road at the Coldplay concert than the knockoff version that they're trying to do at the church. So it's a question of, those strategies might have short-term impact, but whether it really makes a long-term difference is questionable, I think.
I mean, one of the guys that you speak about at the end of the book is a very interesting thinker, is Paul Kingsnorth, who is one of these secular thinkers, but he has made the kind
He's gone all in.
He's gone all in I think Romanian Orthodoxy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But he's very interesting. He's a former kind of Greenpeace activist, isn't he? And he talks about kind of the rewilding of Christianity, and a bit getting a kind of getting in touch again with the kind of mysticism, with experiences that are kind of beyond what he calls the machine. And I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it, that, in these times where we talk about AI a lot. And in a sense, it was like one of the problems of the new atheists, that we end up reducing man to something very very boring, very flat. Yeah. Whereas we want to kind of we're pointed upwards.
It's true, and he has a fascinating story himself, Kingsnorth, of having gone through, a sort of form of teenage atheism, through to quite a long period as a Buddhist, essentially, to even Wicca as well, sort of, and that the progress and the transitions were because I think was always inevitably looking for something to worship. He'd always had this strong sense of there being something outside of himself. He very much, though, will tell you that when he did finally become a Christian, it was a complete surprise to him, because he did not expect that to be the place he would find home. But as I said, again, one of these people looking for that more mystical, ancient form of Christianity in the Orthodox Church. And you're right, his big concern is he sees atheism as just one more way in which there's been a kind of reductionist tendency across the whole of Western culture, and that technology is just another way in which we're accelerating that. We're kind of dehumanizing ourselves, effectively. And for him, ultimately, I think there are some versions of Christianity that he doesn't want to see thrive either, which are the sort of more commercialized ones where essentially, as we've said, it's just kind of pointing people into another form of idolatry or whatever. And he's very much a mystic, I think wants people to return to that sense of the strangeness and the weirdness, and the fact that we're connected, in a mystical sense with God through Christ. And I love the fact that he's there, banging that drum with his own weird story of how he found faith himself and came to Christianity. And it's interesting because he's in. I list him alongside these other interesting secular thinkers like Peterson and others, but they've all got their different way of coming to this. He's on a bit of a different journey to Jordan Peterson, though there's some overlap with them and that kind of thing. I think where Kingsnorth is worried about the direction this could go is he doesn't want to see it turned into just another way of politicizing a culture war, and that's always the danger, I think, with some of these characters like Peterson is if Christianity just starts to get used as a sort of way of saying, here's how we get our political cause back on track, then it's potentially going to, go the wrong direction as well. So I like the way he really wants to focus back on, as you say, this rewilding of putting us back in touch with God, with nature, with that bigger picture. So
in that sense, with all these people kind of holding the door open, as we said, do you think that the churches are kind of ready for the tide to turn, or what can we do to get ready?
I think the church, in a sense, is never ready. I think because often God is working that much further ahead of often where we are, and it's only by God's grace that we find ourselves equipped to meet the needs of the current age. I think sometimes the church can still be answering the questions of 10 or 15 years ago and not necessarily
and fighting those battles as well. Yeah.
So I'd say, it was an important battle to fight, the apologetic battle with the new atheists, but that's not where most people are now. Yeah. Most of the young people I talk to now barely remember the new atheism actually, because they were in nappies when it was happening. So and I think that's where you do need to take a leaf out of people like Jordan Peterson's book, because I think they're they're realizing, and people are now asking these much more existential questions about what is my purpose in an age where I can literally invent myself from scratch, according to a lot of people. Where do I find my identity? And kind of addressing the real psychological burden that puts on young people today. I think the church doesn't realize just how hard it is actually to be young in today's world, where you have to more or less invent your identity. And I think that's where the church should start to pour itself into both, certainly intellectual responses, but also imaginative, artistic responses to
so
that.
in a sense, that the new atheist caused us to kind of go up and onto the dusty shelves and get, Thomas Aquinas down and, some of the great kind of Catholic philosophers and, dust those off, put those out anew in new language. And then now maybe we need to rediscover the mystics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And the thing is that religion hasn't really gone away. It's just gone into different new channels. So people, I think, are inherently religious. They need a story to live by. But as I say, the stories that they're telling themselves are becoming increasingly threadbare and can't support the weight of a meaningful life. So I think the church has to be in the business of telling its story better in that sense. That will be partly through re-engaging the intellectual side of its tradition, but also the artistic side, the mystical side of its tradition.
Who would you point to in that?
Well,
kind of
one of the
area?
best recent examples would be C.S. Lewis. It's sometimes too easy to reach for Lewis as the example, but he was, again, one of those people who brought the head and the heart together, because he did great apologetics through the problem of pain, mere Christianity, but he made people want it to be true when he wrote the Narnia stories. He showed them a world which they wished existed and said, well, what if it did exist in our world? When Lucy says, do I have to go back to my world? And Aslan says, well, you will know me there by another name. And I think that's the challenge, of the church, to say, to cast a picture of the faith where people would really want the world to be like that. And then they can perhaps say, well, what if it is true?
And I think in one sense, just going back to that kind of initial poem, we often have a very linear view of history, as if things are going to carry on going in the same direction that they've always been going in, and yet we can see throughout history that that Christianity has kind of died and risen again.
There's another
many
great
times.
quote, isn't there, by G.K. Chesterton along those lines? I think something like Christendom has experienced a series of deaths, but it has always been reborn because it has a
God who knew the
his
way.
way out of the tomb. And I just think that's a great example of the way in which we are often very short-sighted, as I say, thinking this age, we're chronological snobbery, as Lewis puts it.
Right.
We think that what's happening in our age is defining. Whereas actually, you go back, and throughout history, there's been moves of God where it looks like the church was on its knees, but then something has come in and changed. And I just wonder whether we're at one of those tipping points at this point. I'm not a good prophet of what will be, but I just noticed something changing in the atmosphere. And as you say, I think it's not just a linear progression. I think we live in a tidal world where things go out and then come back in again.
Yeah, and in a sense, what's going to be really? It's easy to get kind of depressed a bit sometimes in the kind of Christian world. It's all going the wrong direction. But in fact, to know that what's going to be really fun is to see how God raises up new thinkers, new prophets, new saints,
and to have faith as well.
Yeah.
I've been a bit concerned in my world, the more evangelical Protestant part of the world. There's been a lot of scandals, a lot of naysaying, a lot of pessimism and cynicism really about Christianity, and I totally understand that when you look at some manifestations of Christianity. But at the same time, we are called to be people of faith. Yes, we are completely fallible humans, in the church, but we've got a God who has always worked with us and been able to produce something pretty amazing in the process. So I hope that the book and the podcast is a bit of a call to Christians to have more faith in a God who takes a much bigger picture than them, and to hopefully respond to his call to do what they need to do, what they're being called to do, to engage people in what I think is possibly one of the greatest moments of opportunity as we see people looking for meaning and purpose and identity in ways perhaps that we haven't been able to see in other years.
Well, it's a wonderful place to finish on an optimistic, or maybe should I say a hopeful note. So just tell me, the book also kind of kicked off a new podcast for you. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so
where people can listen to those
The book and
stories.
the podcast have the same name, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And both of them are telling this story of how new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. So if you go to my website, you can find access to them both. That's at justinbrierley.com. But yeah, the book is a kind of good way in, but the podcast is a kind of much more long-form documentary style way where you hear from a lot of the people I've been mentioning, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, Bishop Barron, Jordan Peterson. And I try to weave all of their stories and narratives and examples together to kind of give this sense of how new atheism sort of tailed off and the way in which it's being replaced by this new conversation.
Well, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I hope to kind of check in with you in a few years, listen lots more stories of people who've found faith.
God willing, there will be, but thank you for the opportunity to come on.
Thank you so much.